It's so funny how like eventually you sort of realize that people research what they have.
Yeah,
And so like as she's talking about like the childhood perfectionism as a
yeah,
result of, the self-doubt and
yeah,
self-criticism, I was like, huh, Dr. Horney, do
yeah.
you think that's something you suffered from?
Yes, exactly. It's like, ooh, this is close to home.
Yeah.
And probably the reason that it's passed through evolution, that this is actually a pretty adaptive trait if you work with it well.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Hello there. Welcome to the Good.Enough.Shrink podcast. We are your hosts. I am Jenna Chang, a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist practicing here in Los Angeles, California.
And I'm Dr. Patrick Kelly. I am also a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist practicing in the Los Angeles area.
We are on a mission to demystify child psychiatry and have conversations surrounding difficult topics on youth and adult mental health, but not without a little play along the way. Welcome to the podcast. Today, we are talking about neurosis and anxiety from a developmental perspective. And this episode is really inspired by the works of Karen Horney, who spearheaded a radically different way of thinking about anxiety, centered around growth and human growth. She showed us that really understanding anxiety is worthy of our efforts, our greatest efforts, because it really is important to know the difference between healthy and unhealthy anxiety. So we'll start with some background statistics just to kind of settle us and then go into the core psychological underpinnings of anxiety, which we don't really talk about these days. We just call it anxiety, and it's like everybody understands what that means. So anxiety disorders are the world's most common mental disorders, affecting 301 million people in 2019. This is from the World Health Organization report in 2023, which I thought was actually a pretty low number. Dr. Kelly, I don't know what you think about this. Like, let's say if we have 8 billion people in the world and we have 300 million people diagnosed with anxiety disorders, that sounds very small to me.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, it seems like their own data contradicts itself in a
Mm,
way because they go on to say that 1 in 4 people will be diagnosed or will meet criteria for an anxiety disorder. So
mm,
the numbers don't quite add up. So that might
right.
be, if I'm telling myself a story, that might be point prevalence or the people who said
Mm,
yes at the time they were asked. But I think although it does seem like a low percentage, 300
mm.
million people is still a lot of people. So even the people who said yes in the moment that they were surveyed is a large number of people suffering with anxiety.
Yeah. Clinically, I feel like it's quite a lot more than what comes up in numbers. These anxiety disorders are the most common mental illnesses in the United States, affecting over 40 million adults or 19% of the population in the past year. This was actually back in 2007, so kind of old data here.
And that's actually a really good point. Not all, but a lot of these data are from before the pandemic. And so I think
Mhm.
many more people are familiar with maybe not the disorder, but the feeling of anxiety and the feelings that come out of that. And so I think it's a much more relatable idea. Whereas prior possibly to that and to people talking more about anxiety, even the quarter at most of the population who were affected by it, there was a stigma or a negative feeling about anxiety. And I think now it's a little more discussed. So it would be interesting to see if those numbers have changed and expanded since then, possibly just because more people know what it is and are okay
Mm.
talking about it.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I found that it was either the COVID pandemic and the lockdown reduced people's anxiety because now they could actually stay home and not go out and be in a contained space, or it worsened their anxiety because they're restless and they're social beings and they can't go out. So it seems to have brought about whatever is really going on psychologically, it amplified that with the pandemic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we are going back again in history just to kind of set the stage. So in the 1950s, this was quite a new sort of idea that Karen Horney presented about anxiety, because in Freudian theory, initially he said, quote, "Man by nature is sinful or ridden by primitive instincts," end quote. Essentially, he's saying that we have bad thoughts and feelings, and we have to work to correct them.
Dr. Horney was saying instead
That the goal must be, quote, "different for those who believe there is inherent in human nature both something good and something bad," end quote. And she is relating again to the nature of human growth, that there is a balance and harmony in both sides. And if you integrate them together, understand that together, then you can have growth.
And in full, not disclosure, but a full discussion, Freud did say that there was the id, the dark part of us. There is also the superego, the part of us that is constantly fighting that. But the two exist in such opposition and are constantly, in a way, kind of at war, with the poor ego sitting in the middle, trying to navigate it. Karen Horney has a much more integrated view that both parts exist and can complement each other or can work together to form a whole person, rather than being so cleanly split in half in the Freudian concept.
Right, which is kind of the whole point of therapy, is to kind of find the gray, understand the gray, that things are not black and white relating to CBT concepts. But yeah, so we are, again, talking about childhood because it comes from the way that you saw the world, experienced the world in your early childhood. And she explained that it essentially boils down to the fact that people in the environment are too wrapped up in their own neurosis to be able to love the child or even to conceive of him as the particular individual that he is. As a result, the child does not develop a feeling of belonging, but instead a profound insecurity. This is what she called basic anxiety. This basic anxiety is nothing bad. It's natural. It's part of the human experience. This is from her book in 1950. So really, this makes sense with some of the other things we talked about, the psychosocial stages by Erickson, where the very first stage of development is trust versus mistrust. And we can also relate it to attachment theory, which has a lot to do with knowing that somebody's in your corner, always, has your back, trusting that there's a bond that is secure. So, I mean, in the 50s was a great time for this, that, all of these concepts came up together around the same time, emphasizing interpersonal relationships, social bonds around you. And
Dr. Horney specifically
emphasized that the lack of feeling of belonging will create basic anxiety.
And I think it's interesting to go back to imagining what that's like, because a lot of us don't really think about that. But, even before birth, before consciousness, before all of that, there is no concept. And so the first concept of consciousness is that you exist. And part of that intrinsic definition is you exist as an individual. You exist separately from anything else. And if you go deep enough into that, the idea of being separate, almost by definition, places you at risk. So I think for Dr. Horney, she's not saying that you start from a good relationship where you're bonded with your parent and then that's fractured and then you develop basic anxiety, which is fear and loneliness and isolation. But you start there. That's why it's called basic. You recognize that you are a separate individual, and that creates the basic anxiety. So we've said this before. Again, it's not that bad parents create basic anxiety by rejecting their children. It's that every conscious entity develops this as a natural part of achieving consciousness.
Right. And so, therefore, the growth part is so important, is that you have a lot to grow from. that it starts out really precarious and uncertain and confusing. And you develop that confidence, security as you navigate the world. So, in healthy human relationships, we naturally move toward, against, or away from others. And these moves are not mutually exclusive. I think we all know that we can love and hate someone at the same time. We can find something annoying and endearing at the same time. And so they're not mutually exclusive. But in the child who feels that they stand on this very precarious ground because of his basic anxiety, these moves become rigid because the child will not know what to do with these fundamentally contradicting attitudes toward other people. You want to stay close, but you need to move away, but also you want to go back. And so they will then try to solve this big problem by making one move consistently. So, very rigidly, their prevailing attitude will be either compliance, very much moving toward, aggressiveness, moving against and fighting, or aloofness, moving away and staying away. This is also related to attachment styles, avoidant, anxious attachment styles. You can kind of think of them all in the same realm. However, if the child had a sense of belonging, them feeling inferior to others would not be so serious a handicap. It's actually fine. If he lives isolated, however, his only solution is to develop this urgent need to lift himself above others because of this weak core of not feeling like he belongs. Then what happens naturally is that he self-idealizes. The idealization is to then remedy the damage brought on by the real self. The child cannot stand the real self and the real situation. So then there is this idealization to protect oneself. And this is called neurotic pride. And there's different ways that pride as a word is defined. I think mainstream pride has a negative connotation. And
Yeah, it's one of the deadly sins. It's not a
right.
not a good word typically, but then it's also a celebration. You have a pride parade. So it's a
Mhm.
complicated term. And
Yes.
I think that one of the difficulties of interpreting all of these theories is that, not everyone who writes them, English is their first language. So they're all translations of translations. And so the language is approximate and language is complicated. And even a term like the real self is a distinguished term that Dr. Horney uses in a very specific way, even though the word itself can casually mean something else. So same with pride, same with neuroticism. So
Mhm.
we're throwing out a lot of terms, but
Yeah.
it's critical to understanding the theory to know what each term means in this context. So bear with us. It's
Yes.
worth it.
It is. It's very much worth it. And jumping off of that, there is healthy narcissism versus neurotic pride. And what she was trying to differentiate was, again, like this healthy part versus unhealthy.
So narcissism is another one of those terms that people throw around casually, and it has in our DSM, our diagnostic manual, it has its own term. Freud had his own definition of it, but the origin of narcissism comes from, like so many things, especially in psychology, Greek mythology. So there was the Greek myth of Narcissus, who was a character who saw a reflection of himself in a pool of water and fell so deeply in love with himself that he drowned, that he died. And so the original terminology of narcissism to compare somebody to Narcissus is to say that they're so self-obsessed, so selfish, so in love with themselves that it leads to their approximate or literal death. So in the DSM, there's the personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, which is not what we're talking about. This is the idea of narcissism in self-love, which can have a very positive connotation. Self-esteem, self-love, reflecting positively on oneself and one's accomplishments, one's achievements. in Dr. Horney's discussion, she talks about the development of narcissism, and she specifically calls it healthy narcissism in response to the basic anxiety, the fear, the loneliness, the feeling less than of sort of giving oneself a pep talk, building oneself up in a healthy way, not in a pathological way. So the term narcissism, as she uses it, is not a pathological term.
Right. Exactly. And when it crosses into a pathological side is when healthy narcissism turns into neurotic pride, which fuels something called neurotic claim. So she talked about, generally we don't really claim things, we wish for things. We think, oh, I want that job promotion. I wish I had that. And when you wish for something, we hope and strive for it. And so then we can feel that we earn it. In a claim, a neurotic claim, we assume things fall into our laps and that we deserve it. And this is problematic because it's based on this idealized self. We're living in this ideal version of ourselves, and we assume that things will happen for us. And when they don't, we are heartbroken, stemming from this inherent sense of not feeling like you belong, leading to a need to uplift oneself above others so that you protect yourself. And then crossing over to the pathological side of not just wishing for something, but claiming that you already have it. You should have it. And so when these claims are not realized, we feel immensely upset. How could I not be the class valedictorian 5 years in a row? How is this possible? And this is the ideal self that the child built because his real self was unacceptable. His real self did not feel he belonged anywhere.
And I think the key to that is that I claim it because I deserve it. There's some part of me that feels entitled to it. And I think that when people think of narcissistic personality disorder, this is actually what they're talking about. So what she calls neurotic pride is much more similar to what we would call narcissistic personality disorder, where you assume that you deserve this, that, or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's a claim to something, it's not a wish for something, you just think it's going to fall from the sky because the universe should give it to you because you deserve it, as opposed to putting together a plan and working for something and striving for something and realizing it, or thinking of it as a pure wish that may or may not happen. It's I deserve to be class valedictorian because I'm so special, which is really a reaction to, I'm not special at all, and I can't tolerate that. That's terrible. So it almost feeds on itself. In a weird way, the less you get and the more you're frustrated, the worse you feel about yourself, which almost strengthens the response to that, which is the neurotic pride. So it's a funny, weird process. I can't think of another word than weird because it's
weird.
so contrary to most people's instincts. But the worse you feel about yourself, sometimes the more prideful you become as a reaction to that.
Yeah. And I'm thinking also about, it's like the more you know, the less you know. And without that sort of narcissistic personality or without the neurotic pride, both kind of more pathological, if you're in the healthy narcissism realm, the more you know, the less you know, you can tolerate that. That's okay. I can accept that. But if you are more on the pathological side of unhealthy neuroticism and narcissism, you cannot. And so you isolate and alienate, which we will get into. So essentially, when you can't have what you want, there is this concept of the tyranny of the shoulds. So due to the neurotic pride and the neurotic claim, we will then feel that we should have known all the possibilities. I should have known that my mother was going to leave me, or I should have been able to prevent my brother from getting into a car crash. These shoulds become unbearable and ultimately leads to self-contempt, self-hatred. this can develop into perfectionism and fear in children. And so this was quite like a moment where I had to like pause the book because yeah, you realize, wow, I mean, we as humans must be living in so much like agony because you're feeling like you deserve something, you're feeling like this should be happening and it's not happening, and you can't make any sense of it. And so it must be me. It must be my problem. Like, what is wrong with me? And this is, again, the basis of insecurity, the low self-esteem, is that I can't make sense of what's going on. It must be me. And when this happens in a child, they carry that with them.
It's so interesting to me to look through different lenses at the same thing, that a bunch of people were noticing the same progress and maybe defined it or described it a little bit differently, but definitely identified that something was happening. So this concept of the self-contempt emerging from the shoulds and the frustration about the claims is very similar to Freud's concept that depression is anger turned inwards. When you're actually angry and frustrated and mad, but you turn that on yourself, that's what leads to depression. It's a similar transformation of frustration and disappointment and anger turning to something about me is wrong or it's my fault. Just people are describing it so differently and conceptualizing it in a different way. So I think that the idea that it's a universal experience makes a lot of sense. It's something everyone goes through. And Dr. Horney is looking at it and describing it a little bit differently. So it's so fun.
Yeah.
My inner nerd thinks it's so fun to look at all these different phenomenon from different conceptualizations.
Yes, it is so fun. I can't even begin to describe how fun it is. But so what it comes down to is that if you feel that anxiety is a big factor in your life, then you are essentially existing between rigid extremes. Either you're absolutely helpful and productive, or you're in complete and utter disgrace. These are the extremes at which that you are functioning. And so going back to sort of some of the attachment stuff, your internal and external world are then decoupled. You're rejecting what's actually happening in reality because the only way to preserve your ideal self so that you don't like fall apart is to decouple, be away from it and deny it. So you assuage this feeling by mastery, avoidance, or alienation. Of course, alienation then leads to loneliness, which predicts increased morbidity, mortality, as reported by the US Surgeon General. So, yeah, so this is really complicated, complex stuff. I have to say that I still have some trouble communicating this. I think I can understand it, I can kind of feel it, but to put it into words or to articulate it in the right timing is quite difficult in clinical work.
I totally agree. And I think it becomes more complicated because part of the definition of this is that the person who's going through it rejects anything that threatens the idealized self. So somebody who feels anxious, who expresses some of these traits or ways of going about things that is starting to decouple, if you say you're decoupling, you're ignoring what's actually happening, that just drives them further away. That doesn't bring them closer. So I think that's what people call the art of therapy, is how do you bring somebody forward in their understanding of themselves and what's happening without unintentionally pushing them away from that and strengthening that response or that defense mechanism. It's really hard. And
Exactly.
I am similar. Even saying it conceptually is complicated. I feel like I have a picture of this, but being able to explain it in a coherent way, it's tough. And I
It's so
think
tough.
anyone who's read Dr. Horney's book will find it tough. You got to read each paragraph 3 or 4 times before you know what's actually getting through. It's very dense, and it's a lot of concept that we're trying to distill down, and we're doing our best. But
Yes.
the idea of somebody who realizes they're an individual separate being, feels terrified by that, feels less than those around them, responds to that feeling by protecting themselves, by going the other way with it and feeling superior to other people, and then keeps going in that direction to a pathological extent where they're so superior they deserve all these things. And then they're constantly disappointed because the universe doesn't give them the things they feel that they deserve, making them feel worse about themselves, which strengthens their response to that they need to feel better about themselves. Eventually there's going to be a schism where you can't really even look at yourself because the idea of your true self is so different from how you, depending on how you describe it, want to be or see yourself as. It just becomes more and more radicalized until you are either this perfect being or this terrible disappointment. And a lot of people who I see who I think fit this concept bounce back and forth. There are times they think they are this perfect being, and there are times they think they are this terrible individual who can't do anything right. And it's really painful to see somebody go through this.
And I think this is why, knowing is great, but it's not quite enough. I think this is why attachment theory becomes big for me, in that, yes, like logically, we understand that this is what's happening, but you keep doing it. Every time you look in the mirror, you still hate yourself, and you can't really figure out why. I'm doing this and this and that. I'm accomplishing these things, and I just can't understand why I despise myself so much. And in those moments when you don't like yourself and you have nothing, to have someone that can hear you, that can see you, that can be receptive to your waves of being up and down is incredibly healing. That's when you start to know, oh, I'm okay being who I am. I think there's a certain level at which you can do this yourself. I think, you can work on it on your own. But if you do have a therapist or that one person, it really, really makes it so much easier. If you can walk that path with support, it makes it so much less painful.
I totally agree. And I think it's unfortunate that part of this is the alienation that you're talking about, that the idea of opening up to somebody is so scary that even finding a therapist can feel like too big of a mountain to climb.
Yeah.
So it almost feeds itself in a way. It sort of begets further isolation, whereas the potential solution of sitting down with a therapist and talking through some of these issues feels scarier and scarier the deeper and deeper you get.
So we do also want to address modern categorization of anxiety through the DSM. So of course, the DSM is a little bit more tailored for research. And so they wanted to find a way to categorize these disorders. So they have diagnoses like generalized anxiety disorder, where someone might feel anxious about a lot of different things, a million things at the same time. Or they may have panic disorder, where you randomly, suddenly, out of the blue, you're sitting in your car and you feel like you can't breathe. And it lasts for a couple of minutes and then it goes away like nothing happened. There's also separation anxiety disorder, usually between a child and a parent, where the child is absolutely losing it when separated from the parent. And we can go back to attachment theory a lot with this. And then, of course, very prevalent is social anxiety disorder, kind of came up a lot with the pandemic. And then specific phobias. People can be very fearful. So anxiety is closely related to fear. And you can have a fear of heights, of the dark, of closed spaces. And these are separated in the DSM from personality disorders like narcissistic personality disorder or obsessive compulsive personality disorder, OCPD. The personality disorders are different
from other diagnoses in the DSM because they can be egosyntonic, meaning that the person who has this likes it, utilizes it, and it's adaptive for them. So for example, if we're looking at OCD, OCPD is egosyntonic, they're happy about it, but OCD is ego-dystonic. They're not happy about it because the intrusive thoughts and compulsions and obsessions make them feel really bad about themselves, and they hate themselves, and they have severe depression and anxiety. The personality disorders are more conceptualized under the idea that there's a certain trait that has been pervasive throughout your life, and that trait, whether it's narcissism or compulsions and obsessions or paranoia, these kinds of traits can be a normal part of a person, but it crosses over then to not being able to function at work or school, not being able to maintain relationships. So the idea of personality disorders as an umbrella is that there's a pervasive trait that you have from very early on into adulthood that can create dysfunction in your day-to-day and your interpersonal relationships. So the DSM is complicated because, as you can hopefully hear from how we're talking about it, it's based on symptoms. It's not based on etiology or core psychology. It's like what we see. And so it doesn't explain things, but it can give you a label that makes you maybe feel like it's a little more contained.
The way one of my mentors used to describe it is a field guide. So if aliens landed on Earth and you gave them a field guide to humanity, just like we have field guides about birds, and they're walking around and they say, "Oh, look at this person. They have this level of anxiety. They've had it for this long. They must have generalized anxiety disorder." No information about where it comes from, why they have it, how long they've had it for, what they've tried to treat it, how it's responded, what happened in their life before they developed this anxiety disorder, but just cross-sectionally in this second, if I can freeze time and compare the picture of this person to the picture in the book, that's what they look like. And I understand that for research, you have to be very clean and very specific, and you have to have people who are included in a given study or excluded from a given study. And so you got to have a list of symptoms that somebody has. I get that, but I think it ignores so much about what's actually happening with the person you're treating.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's what's the diagnosis and what is going on. Very separate things. And so just as a reminder too, that all of these core psychological issues are lying mostly in the unconscious. And so, to bring that out onto the surface, to be able to put words to it is the work of therapy. And so I do have to give credit to Freud for this whole concept of, oh, it's in the unconscious. So you are not even talking about it because you don't know it exists. It's quite helpful. We do also have evidence-based therapy treatments for anxiety. And the most prominent of these is, of course, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It is evidence-based and proven to be effective in generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder. Separation anxiety gets a little bit more towards parent training. So because the brain is not fully developed, the frontal cortex isn't quite there. And so it kind of relies more on the parent to put up that boundary and that separation so that the child can then individuate. And so separation anxiety specifically is more about parent training. Not saying that it's the parent's fault. It's just that the child's brain is not quite there.
Right, of course. It's like saying, physical therapy for a broken leg. It's not saying the broken leg is your fault. It's just that you need to do the therapy to help fix it. So for parents, it's not blaming them for the separation anxiety, but it's saying that they are quite literally the adult in the room who needs to be the one who changes and masters these techniques in order to help improve the separation.
Yeah, exactly. Then we have social anxiety, which, I think this is something that, it's just not really talked about as much. You kind of like brush it off as like, oh, the kid or that person has social anxiety, but it's so heavy. It's so heavy because really the biggest predictor of your success in your career, in your personal life, is how you are with other people. I think a lot of times it's based on knowledge and technical skill as well, but also how, like, can you get people to listen to you? Can you get people to like you and hear you? Social anxiety, we work with CBT as well. There's some aspect of behavioral activation. So if somebody is very, very isolated in their own home, just to get out, go take a walk, 10 minutes around the block, or sign up for that one interactive class, just, once a month. And there's some also component of exposure response therapy that actually gets us into also specific phobias and OCD. Specifically, the exposure and response type of therapy is extremely effective. And these are all very much based on behavior. So, behaviorally, we're looking at classic CBT: emotions, thoughts, action. There's a triangle here. And because we can't really control our emotions, we can kind of control our thoughts, but it's hard, but we can certainly change our behavior. And so once you change one part of the triangle, the other parts of the triangle will naturally adjust and adapt. And so we are looking at, similar to the DSM in a way, coming from the symptom standpoint, coming from a behavioral action-based standpoint, and then slowly changing your thoughts and emotions over time. This is very different from what psychology and psychiatry has been doing for, prior to the 50s and the 60s, which is psychoanalysis. You're going from very much your thoughts and emotions, feelings, underlying unconscious drives to changing your behavior, which was very, very difficult, is difficult. So in our work, we try to balance a little bit of both. Sometimes you don't have mental space to think through. Just the emotions are overwhelming. And so you just change the behavior, stick to a routine and a structure, and let that sit. Other times we feel that things are settled and we can dive into the why, the how your life has come to this point. And that can be very painful, very vulnerable, very, very exposed, but it's part of the deep and core crucial work of balancing the internal and external world and integrating them together.
And I think a good therapist can do both and does do both, because especially for anxiety, the more you avoid something and don't face it, the bigger and scarier it feels, the bigger and scarier it becomes. So if I'm afraid of heights and I'm going to someone to do therapy about that and talk through my fear of heights and why do I have a fear of heights and where did this come from and what happened to me that made me afraid of heights, I can do that forever. But until I actually get on top of a mountain and prove to myself that it's not as scary as my brain is making it feel, not a lot will change. At the same time, if my therapist just says, okay, run on top of the mountain and then come back and you're good, you're cured. But why? Where is this coming from? And so both pieces are really important and really critical. And I think it seems to me that it's natural, especially for people with anxiety, to lean more towards the thoughts and to talking about it and to lean away from the actual exposure and the actual doing of getting past it and that experiential emotional knowledge and awareness as opposed to intellectual knowledge and awareness, which is why it's so important to move somebody towards confronting it in the real world, not just doing thought experiment after thought experiment and thinking about it, especially for kids.
And to aid that, we do have medication treatments to help alleviate some of that really high anxiety when you are pushing yourself to expose yourself to the very thing that you fear. So I know we haven't really talked about medications thus far, but it's a big part of our work. The point is that, it's a lot more than medicine, but the medicine can help. So the first line treatments for both children, adolescents, and adults is SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. These are medications like Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro. You may have heard of them. And they essentially, I like to think of it like they don't take away anxiety. They give you more ways to cope and that you can stand it a little bit easier. And so the stressors in your life may not change, and the anxiety level really may not change as much, but you can then cope with it better.
And just to talk a little more about that, one thing that does come up is that the SSRIs are not a quick treatment. It's not, I'm about to go climb up that mountain. Let me just take my Lexapro beforehand. It takes weeks because it really functions more like a supplement. It helps your body hold on to more of the serotonin it's making anyway. It doesn't really give you something that's not there to begin with. And that takes time to make a change. So that is the gold standard because it works very well, not because people feel it the strongest or it works the most quickly or any of those things. We'll talk about some of those medications, but this is more of a long-term approach.
Right. And I think we can also have entirely another episode on all of these medications. If people are interested, we can dedicate an episode to them. But yeah, exactly. It takes time to change the expression of your genetics with the SSRIs. And also there's ongoing research about this, but it seems like it's not as simple as the rise and fall of serotonin, that there is the activation and expression of certain genes. And then there's also something about the balance of the rise and fall that can create better coping. Then we have anxiolytics, basically separated into two categories. One is the benzodiazepines, and people might be very familiar with benzos, which are Xanax, Valium, Ativan, and then the non-benzodiazepine anxiolytics, which are medications like hydroxyzine. We use it in kids a lot. Propranolol is another medication. Buspirone is another medication. So the idea is that we have a lot of options for you. And if you are interested in medications because it's been really, really tough and you're kind of at your wit's end, talk to a mental health professional, psychiatric provider. There's many, many ways that we can address this and that there is hope.
And I will say that all of the evidence that we have does show that medications and psychotherapy work best when they're used together, that the medications make the therapy more approachable and more achievable. And the therapy is, in some cases, the treatment of choice, but also helps the change that occurs from the medications settle in and become more long lasting and helps you build those skills and adapt to that change, as opposed to just taking a pill and hoping for an overall reduction in anxiety, which, as you said, Dr. Chang, is not always the outcome that we are even looking for when we start a medication.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it requires patience and it requires trial and error. I think the other thing that's really important is that we actually have pretty good evidence that medications help with anxiety. Not so much depression. Depression is a little more difficult. There's just so many different ways that depression presents. But with anxiety, even with adolescents, we have pretty good evidence that the SSRIs can be very beneficial for anxiety, a little more than depression. But again, it won't cure. It's not a cure. It is management. And so the synergy of the two, therapy and medications together, is the best combination that we have against this. So sort of wrapping up, maybe zooming away from all of that and just thinking, if you are listening to this and you are a clinician, a therapist or a psychiatrist or a medical student, resident, anyone that works with patients, it's important to know, I think, that anxiety is not a one-word definition or condition. It's really complicated and it's rooted in childhood and feeling, for whatever reason, that you didn't belong. And so addressing anxiety can be very, very close to heart for people who are in this field of work. And, you can either be very much consumed by it and emotionally, psychologically, a little bit paralyzed by it, or you can be very, very avoidant of it and throw a medication on there, send them to the PHP program, intensive therapy program. And it can feel like close to heart. And so I think it's really important for us to do our own work so that we can really feel the anxiety, be present with the patient in the room, and have that non-judgment and empathy, which is the single most important thing. When somebody is coming to you and reporting severe anxiety and not knowing what to do about it, to have someone listen and be calm and empathic and accepting, it's as close as we can get to the magic pill. So it's really important, I think, for us to do our own work.
I think it can also help regulate. Anyone who's anxious, being in the room with a calm person just has an effect. It brings people down. So I think us being able to recognize when our own anxiety is peaking, or, speaking for myself, our own sense of helplessness or difficulty in working with someone with anxiety, where you think you've tried all these things and it's not getting better and it's getting frustrating, and checking in and remaining as stabilizing as you can for the person you're there with. I think we also talk about anxiety as a condition, as a disorder, but it's also important to say that people get anxious and people get worried. And I think that sometimes anxiety, even with a little a, can insert itself into treatment and make treatment more difficult. So, sometimes people don't call you and make an appointment because they forget. Sometimes it's because they're anxious over what might happen. Same with, for practitioners who are not in the psychiatric field, surgeons, people cancel surgery because they're worried about the surgery, So having a basic knowledge of how this plays out, where this comes up, and what you can do to help both in the moment and in the long run is one of the most useful skills you can have as any sort of a patient care provider. One thing to remember is that there's no perfect way to deal with anxiety. Some people deal with anxiety by calming down. Some people deal with anxiety by going for a run. But by recognizing it and not seeing it as a weakness or a deficit or something that's wrong, and realizing that there is something you can do about the anxiety you're having by itself can make you feel a lot better. So figuring out what works for you, figuring out what works for your patients, if you are a patient, doing that work and trying different things and figuring out what does work, working with a therapist. Because if there was one way to treat anxiety, we'd all do it. There isn't. Everyone's going to respond in their own way. This discussion has been really focused on neurosis and the origin of anxiety from that perspective. Anxiety could be a whole podcast in itself that could cover 100 episodes. So if there are other questions, other topics we didn't cover, other things that would be interesting to hear about, let us know. It's most important to us that we present information that's useful, that people want to know more about.
Yes, we would love to hear from you guys. If you had comments or questions, please shoot us a text message. You can do that on our podcast link, or you can submit a comment. We would love to hear from you. Okay.
I feel like we're YouTube people now. Like and subscribe.
Yes, like right. Like and subscribe. Oh man, we are them. We are those people.